So the first thing I'm going to do, here we go, is I'm going to talk about state violence and European borders. And this is what I'm really interested in. I'm not going to talk about any other parts of the world. So we have the performance of state violence, particularly problematic in the Mediterranean. The Missing Migrants Project tells us that we've had at least 28,000 missing persons in the Mediterranean in the past 10 years. And I want briefly to look at why is this happening? Why is this not stopping? Why do we have an increasing number of deaths in the Mediterranean? So I've taken as an example the Steccato di Cutri tragedy, one which happened in February this year, over 70 deaths, quite a large boat foundered on its way to Italy. And one of the things which I find that this particular example provides us with is some insights into the interrelationship between the borders of state sovereignty and the European Union in the form of the agency Frontex. How does state sovereignty work in making permissible this kind of tragedy? And the first thing I think we need to bear in mind is that with the creation of a whole series of very sophisticated surveillance mechanisms, throughout the whole of the progress of this boat across the Mediterranean, Frontex was following it online. It was under surveillance constantly, and Frontex officers watched as the boat foundered and people died. So it's not for lack of knowledge. The Steccato di Cutri didn't founder and result in the death of 70 people because nobody knew it was there or by accident. It happened under our eyes. So what happened? We have, first of all, through the surveillance program of Frontex, the executive director notified the Italian authorities that a ship was approaching Italian shores and recommended that there be a criminal justice response, that this was a case of smuggling or trafficking in human beings. The Italian authorities responded to that notification by the Frontex director and sent a police boat out, a Guardia di Finanza boat, out to intercept the Steccato di Cutri boat to arrest the people who were on board for smuggling in human beings. Of course, the police boat couldn't get out there because the water was way too rough. The seas were very, very high, and the ship was already foundering. Now, why was no one saved, or so few people saved from this boat which was sinking? It was because neither the Frontex executive director nor the Italian authorities called for or initiated a search and rescue at sea operation. This is the famous SARS operations, which are covered by the international law of the sea. The legal basis on which any authority which is aware of a ship which is foundering, which may well give rise to loss of life, and therefore a SARS operation must be instigated, is distress. When the Frontex director was called before the European Parliament later in March 2023, and was questioned by parliamentarians about why his agents did not instigate a SARS response of distress when it was apparent from the recordings of the ship and what was happening on the sea that this boat was going to sink. The director of Frontex, and this is a director who's only been in place for less than a year, said this to the European Parliament: you could argue that a small rubber boat, which this wasn't, it was a large boat with over 150 people on it, trying to cross an ocean, or in this case, the Mediterranean, is always in distress. That is true. But I think our threshold is a bit higher than that. This claim by the executive director of Frontex is an affront to both international law, the international law of the sea, which gives a very precise definition of what distress is, and that definition, which has been copied and pasted into the 2016 revision of the Frontex regulation as to what distress is. So there was the director of Frontex states to the European Parliament that he personally is entitled to have a sovereign right to determine what distress is. He will decide what constitutes distress, and he does not need to have regard either to international law binding on the European Union, nor indeed on the regulation under which his institution, Frontex, is established. One of the questions which I think we need to take very seriously is the result, which is the executive director is claiming that he is entitled to have surveillance over the Mediterranean and follow boats, but there is no responsibility for the loss of life which may occur. Violence at external borders doesn't only take place in the form of a failure to rescue, which is a criminal offense in many member states, including Italy. We also have violence at land borders, the Poland-Belarus border. We have the report of Human Rights Watch in 2022, tremendous violence being meted out on people at that particular border. We have the Black Book of pushbacks in the Balkans with horrifying stories of violence at borders. And we also have the example of violence at the Greek sea border, and I'll come back to this again a bit later, which forced the departure, the resignation of the then executive director of Frontex in April 2022 as a result of an investigation by another part of the European Commission, OLAF, the Agency Against Corruption, for failing to stop or investigate human rights abuses, including failure to rescue against people at the Greek and Italian external borders. So we now need to see whether or not the current director of Frontex will have to follow his predecessor out of office and who will come next. Okay, having set out what's happening, this incredible amount of violence, I want to go back to my main theme, which is the question of state sovereignty, the EU and border controls. So why is it that we see this really shocking level of violence at some borders? And remember, this isn't happening at all borders across the European Union. This is happening at only some borders. We did a very large report in 2022. I'll put the website where you can find it is later in the PowerPoint, for Pro-Asile as well as various of the groups in the European Parliament on monitoring of borders. And one of the things that came out of the over 50 interviews we had with various bodies across the European Union was that you can pinpoint where border violence will take place by following certain border guard teams that are notorious for border violence. This came through very clearly from our Hungarian colleagues who could tell us exactly where border violence was going to happen, that it wouldn't happen at these border crossing points or in between these border crossing points, it would happen over there, from our Slovenian colleagues, and also from the people we interviewed in Greece and in France. So why borders? What is happening which is causing those borders to be places of this violence? The next question is, what borders? Are these borders of the member states? Why is a European Union institution engaged in permitting violence to be taking place at these borders? And what I'm going to look at is in particular the conceptualization of state sovereignty from the perspective of what the modern state is, which is the borders are the place where we sort out the citizens from the aliens. So which citizens get to enter, which don't. It's also a problem about the status of border guards. Who are they and what are they doing? Internally, we're looking at the definition of the modern state as a territory, a people, and a bureaucracy, which makes a claim, a successful claim, to a monopoly over the use of violence. Internally, this is policing, and externally, this is the army. Classic theory of the state in the 20th and 21st century. And the exercise of this sovereignty claim is the pure bureaucratic right to define who are the people who belong on which territory. So the bureaucracy says, these are our citizens, and those are not our citizens. This is our territory. That is not our territory. And that means that the place where these three essential elements of the modern state come together is at the border. It's in the performance of claims on persons to cross borders. We can see the problems in respect of claims about territory in Ukraine. And of course, people have had their citizenship changed from Ukrainian to Russian and back again in a number of situations already in the last couple of years, let alone where those borders are. The people of Crimea belong to whom now? How long are their passports going to be Russian ones? We have all of these questions around how sovereignty is expressed and what it means in terms of people who are moving. So our question is, why borders? Because there you can do the performance of state sovereignty. There you have our three elements, the bureaucracy, which is deciding who gets to enter and who doesn't, having decided already who the citizen is, having decided where the border is. We have the, which borders are they going to be? And this is, are they borders of the European Union or are they borders of the member states? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Our sorting out of our citizens, our status of border guards, and again, this will come up again. Are they military? Are they police? Are they administrative? And I've been following, you may have been following this as well, the very radical change which has taken place in Portugal, where there has border and migration has been taken away from the police and given to an independent administrative agency, so that the question of who is deciding is no longer being taken under the suspicion of security, internal or external. And then we have the question of what is the status of people at the border? And that, of course, as we all know, is a point of tremendous vulnerability. Anybody who turns up at the border of any country which is not their own will recognize the vulnerability that even we academics feel when we're seeking to enter a country other than our own, a moment when you are most vulnerable to the claims of the state, to require you to produce documents, to require you to produce evidence of who you are, and to refuse you admission. Our most recent reification in the international community about this entitlement to state sovereignty over border control is in the UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration in 2018. And you have this, this statement, paragraph 15C, that national sovereignty remains the key. Now, there are two things about this statement about national sovereignty in respect of migration and the border. And that is that in two places you will see someone has slipped in there the requirement that the actions of state must be in conformity with international law and in accordance with international law. This means that the red in tooth and claw approach to state sovereignty, that the bureaucracy can make any decision it wishes about the territory and the people, has been accepted as being limited by international law. This is part of the reason why at the adoption of the compact, when the previous president was in power in the United States, the US withdrew from the process of the compact. Into that world of state sovereignty and state sovereign claims, we have the European Union, which arrives on the scene. And this happens with the 1992 project, which is about the abolition of intra-member state borders and a common external border policy, which becomes an agency. I'm not going to go into the questions of coherence of the Schengen process, where there are 4 member states which are still not in the Schengen system, and there are 5 states which are not EU states which are in the Schengen system. But we have the idea that the abolition of border controls is a very good idea and will make everybody happier, richer, and more peaceful. And to a large extent, this has certainly been the story of the abolition of border controls within the European Union. This has not been the story of the common external border, the development of an agency, an EU agency in respect of external border controls, and the what we might call the banalization of border violence. What we do have is with the introduction of the EU onto the scene, a question of shared competence. So Frontex is never fully competent. Member states are never fully competent. I'm going to come to this again in a minute. And the question is, who is responsible for border violence? So between our sovereign claims about borders and border violence, we had in the summer a decision from the General Court of the Court of Justice of the European Union. This is a direct action where some Syrian nationals, a family plus some other people who were on a Greek island and wanted to seek asylum were expelled to Turkey in a Frontex operation. So the Greek authorities asked Frontex to coordinate what they call a return operation to expel a number of people from the island to Turkey, which they did. However, in the process of this, the Greek authorities had never considered the asylum applications of these Syrians. This is at a time when even now Syrian asylum applications have a very high recognition rate in the European Union. And the Greek authorities had never issued expulsion decisions against them. And of course, in EU law, it is unlawful under the Returns Directive to expel anyone from your territory if you haven't at least gone so far as to draw up an expulsion decision. WS and the others brought a direct action against Frontex for damages for what they had, for the damage which they had suffered through an unlawful expulsion from Greece, which was carried out by Frontex. WS and the WS family are now living in a very precarious situation in Iraq, in northern Iraq. And the question was Frontex responsible? Everybody agreed Frontex carried out the expulsion. Now, the General Court for the moment has said no, because it wasn't Frontex's responsibility to receive the asylum applications or to take the expulsion decisions. And because it wasn't their responsibility to do either of those things, it was therefore not their responsibility. They were not responsible for the damage that was caused. Though everyone agrees they would never have been expelled if there hadn't been a Frontex operation to expel them. The case is going to go to the full Court of Justice. The appeal has already been made and the arguments are being put forward, and we'll see what the full court has to say. But this is a classic example of who has state sovereign responsibility over these individuals and the damage which is caused to them. So whose sovereignty is it? What kind of state sovereignty is engaged in this kind of violence at the borders? And here we have, first, this is a state sovereignty of the member states. We go back to the Global Compact. Only states have state sovereignty over their borders and migration and who comes in and who doesn't. But what happens when an EU agency carries out the acts of sovereignty of the state at the external border? What kind of sovereignty is being exercised? And that means there must be at least the sharing by member states of sovereignty with the EU agency. That takes us to a third kind of sovereignty, the externalization agreements with third countries such as Tunisia, etc., to stop people moving. And is this then a question of buying sovereignty from third countries over the movement of persons? So a number of issues about the transformation of sovereignty, which disassociate state sovereignty from the modern state as we know it, as the bureaucracy, the territory, and the people, with violence being carried out in certain circumstances. If we say that we have a problem with state sovereignty, what kinds of responses do we have to that problem? And here, once again, I would go back to the conceptualization of the modern state, and in particular, rule of law as a component of the modern state's exercise of sovereignty. And it's under the conditions of the rule of law that state sovereignty in being exercised by the bureaucracy is then applied in respect of the claim to a monopoly over violence. So the limits of lawlessness are also the limits of the use of force and violence. And it's the application of the rule of law which determines what those limits are. Now, this is all self-evident if you think about policing and criminal justice. If police carry out violence which is not lawful force within the state, then the criminal justice system will be engaged in respect of that violence. And we have a whole series of examples very recently in a number of member states where police officers have found themselves before criminal courts in respect of excessive use of force. So we understand how this system works, but how is it supposed to work in border control, where it is a shared competence and the rules operate? How are we going to make this principle of rule of law actually also apply in respect of limiting state violence in these circumstances? Ooh, now I went and did it. There you are, you see. I was told to be careful about doing this. It was going to cause a problem. I'm having trouble getting this to move forward. Maybe I'll try again. Be a bit more careful. Okay. So we have our international consensus again from the Global Compact in 2018 on rule of law. I won't read it out there, but again, we have the idea that rule of law and due process are a central part of all aspects of migration governance, including in respect of border violence. And that takes us then to the application of rule of law and border violence. What are the responsibilities of the state authorities? How do we ensure that rule of law and border violence result in the state authorities taking seriously their requirements to apply the test of legality of the use of violence at borders? So how is that going to work? How are we going to implement the test of legality in respect of the lawfulness of violence? So under what circumstances can border guards exercise violence against individuals, whether it's in the form of failing to rescue or whether it's beating them up at the borders? And what are the responsibilities of the agencies, both national and EU? And there you have the website to our report produced for ProAsil and the European Parliament on how do we go about setting up these institutions so we can diminish border violence. If we then go and look at what are going to be our institutions of rule of law in respect of the lawfulness of force, first we have our internal complaints mechanisms, the national and Frontex ones, so the Frontex Fundamental Rights Officer. We've just had a new one who has been appointed and who has to deal with the whole question of what happened with the foundering of the boat in Italy. So an investigation is, I think, not yet fully completed internally. But one of the difficulties of our internal complaints mechanism is that, as in the case of the Fundamental Rights Officer, that role is under the direct authority of the executive director. So as the executive director was the one who made the decision not to recognize distress and take the necessary action of a search and rescue operation, the Fundamental Rights Officer is either going to go to war with the director over that decision or is going to be silenced. We have national bodies, and here we have national human rights institutions, ombudspersons, independent inspectorates of coercive state agencies, and we have quite a lot of experience with those bodies, and in particularly the centrality of their role in respect of unlawful police violence. So we know that things can be done. At the EU, the European Ombudsman has opened a number of inquiries into excessive use of violence at external borders, but her powers are extremely limited. They would need to be extended dramatically to be able to have an effective role in terms of the monitoring and investigation of border violence at EU external borders. And the European Ombudsman's Office would need to be properly networked in with the national human rights institutions and ombudspersons, as we did, for instance, in data protection, setting up a data protection officer, but factoring in and creating a system of national data protection authorities which work together with the European Data Protection Supervisor to ensure that EU law is complied with in that particular field. That's a model which we could look at in respect of getting serious about border violence in the European Union. And here we have the question of the future of the monitoring, inspection, and oversight of border violence. And I would come back again to what I said earlier. Border violence doesn't take place everywhere. And Frontex always says, oh, the European Union has millions of kilometers of borders. How are we ever going to have monitors at all of the different places? And that is throwing sand in your eyes, because we know the NGOs, the National Human Rights Institutes, know where border violence is likely to take place and know what steps need to be taken to monitor the design of border control operations in specific places where there is border violence is likely to take place, possibly to break up and move certain units of border guards which have been engaged in border violence over a period of time and which are notorious, and the instigation of proper rule of law over violence at the external border. What do we need to do in a European context? Well, we need a European response to responsibility. So we have to have the end of this pass the buck between national border authorities and Frontex over border violence. There needs to be a clear linking of surveillance with responsibility for border violence so that Frontex officers can't be sitting there watching on their screens as people are dying without taking any action to launch search and rescue operations. That should happen in Europe is a crime. We need to have a lot more transparency of action, reports, and investigations, which we don't have at the moment. And we need to have a system whereby national human rights bodies are responsible. They have the authority, the funding, and the powers necessary to monitor and investigate border violence. And I think that without this, we are not going to be able to bring external border violence under control and to change the formatting of the thinking about the exercise of state sovereignty at the borders as somehow beyond the rule of law and therefore horrible, but somehow acceptable. Thank you very much for your attention.